Disclaimer.
Hey Greg, sleeping in there?
Oh, Jesus, Chet, you can't sneak up on me like that.
Oh, sorry dear bud, I thought I heard someone snoring.
No, I was having a weird nightmare. Must have dozed off while thinking about that new Candyman movie.
Hey, shouldn't you be working?
Look, boss, I'm technically on my lunch break, which means I can technically use this however I want. So when I'm done, I'll go do your little box stacking, but for now, I think I have a movie to discuss.
Candyman is the 2021 reboot of the supernatural slasher film of the same name released in 1992. In this direct sequel to the original, Chicago artist Anthony McCoy discovers new inspiration for his art, an urban legend of a hook-handed man who appears in the mirror if you say his name 5 times. Directed and written by Nia DaCosta, with further writing from Win Rosenfeld and Jordan Peele, this movie follows the recent trend of producing a direct sequel to a well-regarded classic that's also basically a beat-for-beat remake, like with The Thing, or Blair Witch, or Jurassic World. Now, I know I just lumped together Candyman with a bunch of reboots / remakes that are not exactly, well received, but I don't really think the new Candyman movie is that bad. Honestly, I think it's fine. It's shot fine, the acting's mostly fine. It's fine, you know? It's just fine. Mostly. The biggest issue the Candyman reboot faces is its muddled and fuzzy identity, both thematically and as a piece of horror storytelling. While watching this movie, it's clear that the writers had 2 different visions for what this film could be, and they just couldn't pick one. On one hand, you have this slow, methodical deep dive into these themes and ideas, you know, kinda like the original. And on the other hand, you have this high body count slasher film, which is what would be expected from a film in this genre. It seemed like every time the movie was about to start a thematic deep dive, the writers interrupt with a kill so the audience doesn't fall asleep. Thankfully, the kills are decent enough, using mirrors as a gimmick to keep your eyes actively bouncing between reality and background reflections. And despite what little praise that is, this film is ultimately hampered by how it tries to handle its themes. There's several different important themes being handled by this film, from police violence and gentrification to the impact of storytelling, which is a carryover from the original. And while these topics have a logical through line that can be followed through an academic discussion in the real world, for some reason they just didn't gel right in this movie. There's more than one scene in this movie where you have 2 characters that are sitting down and just explaining political ideas to each other. And I'm sure that's fine for someone who's just being introduced to these ideas through this movie, but it wasn't enough for me. I wanted more. Now, I'm just one white passing Hispanic dude, and I know that my life experiences and my perspective are not universal. I'm not the be-all end-all of understanding art in general, but especially when it comes to a film like Candyman, I highly suggest rounding out your understanding of this film by finding some black critics who have a good understanding of the issues discussed in this movie. With that being said, I like to think that I have a pretty solid enough grasp on the basics of these issues, so when this film is explaining the bare-bone basics of these ideas, I felt like I'd already been here before. You know, I wanted something deeper from this movie, and I knew that it was capable of giving me something more. And this issue is especially evident with how the film discusses the topic of Cabrini-Green. In the original film, Cabrini-Green was the nexus of the Candyman myth, which leaves our main character to investigate the neighborhood as part of her thesis on urban legends. Her hypothesis was that Candyman was a collective myth that helped the Cabrini-Green residents cope with the uncontrollable situation they're in. And she's wrong. Through this conflict, the original movie touched on the issues affecting Cabrini-Green, namely the poverty and crime which gave the housing project its infamous reputation. And despite there being areas of Chicago with higher crime rates at the time, Cabrini-Green's infamous reputation was further spread thanks to its close proximity to Gold Coast and Lincoln Park, 2 very expensive neighborhoods home to plenty of affluent white folks terrified of the crime in their backyard. Now, you might be surprised to find this out, but the vast majority of crimes committed are committed by people who are put in a negative situation and have next to no ways to climb up the social ladder in a way that's, accepted. On January 3rd of 2020, a Philadelphia cashier at Rite Aid was given a note by a man wearing a gray hoodie and black gloves. The note read, "Give me all the money. I'm sorry. I have a sick child. You have 15 seconds. While no weapon was shown, the suspect walked away with an undetermined amount of cash. A similar event occurred at a Philadelphia smoke shop in July of 2019, where a man in a hoodie drew a gun and demanded the owners give him money for his daughter's kidney transplant. After being given several $100s, the man declared the money wasn't enough for the surgery, gave the money back, and left. Let me make it clear, we are not excusing crime. Any victim of a crime will tell you it's not a great experience, and we're not about to argue what crimes are and aren't okay. We're currently interested in the question of why someone would commit a crime like the 2 robberies I've just described. So let's explore the topic and how it relates to the subject of Cabrini-Green. While there's more than one way to classify types of crime, for the sake of this video, we'll be boiling down criminal activity into 3 categories. First, there's crimes against the person, or violent crimes such as murder, manslaughter, aggravated assault, sexual assault, and robbery. Second, we have crimes against property, which are crimes such as burglary, larceny, theft, auto theft, and arson. While some of these crimes can be classified either way, generally, the difference between property crimes and crimes against persons is whether or not the victim is the subject of violence or threats of force when the crime is being committed. And if you think that's a dumb distinction to make, take it up with the FBI, because I just paraphrased their own definitions of these crimes. Links in the description. According to the FBI, in 2019, there was an estimated 1.2 million violent crimes reported versus an estimated 6.9 million property crimes reported. Now, the third type of crime is one that's not usually recorded by crime databases, which are often called victimless crimes. These include crimes like drug use, prostitution, gambling, or selling lemonade on your front lawn without a license, Jimmy. While we could continue diving into the FBI's crime statistics, I think it's a reasonable conclusion that in the cases of crimes such as theft, robbery, prostitution, and drug trade, a good percentage of these crimes are conducted primarily for financial reasons. But then why do people turn to crime instead of legitimate jobs? Well, there's a convincing argument to be made in strain theory. Through strain theory, sociologist Robert Merton proposes that there are socially accepted goals present in societies off which citizens measure their success. When a citizen is unable to achieve this success, this results in pressure or strain on the individual to find a new way to achieve that goal. Thus, deviance, especially in the form of crime, is committed when an individual lacks the means to achieve the goals of their society in an acceptable way. In the United States, that societal goal is the American dream. The idea that the United States is a place where anyone can be financially successful if you're a hard enough worker. It's this idea of a meritocracy, where the wheat and the chaff are naturally separated through upward mobility. Through this philosophy, wealth becomes a measurement of merit and admirable traits. If you're rich, it must be because you're smarter, more clever, and more hardworking than everyone else. It's not because you have rich parents and received countless taxpayer dollars in corporate bailouts, nah. Clearly, if you're rich, you're just better than everyone else, and those dirty poors are lazy bums who refuse to work and invest in their futures. Unfortunately, this line of thinking doesn't account for how much more difficult it is to become financially successful if that person doesn't have money to invest in their future in the first place. As stated in the Poverty and Inequality Report, quote, "The poor are not only disadvantaged because they have less money, but also because money is increasingly needed to buy goods, services, and even opportunities for their children. In a deeply commodified regime, parents are left to purchase high-quality childcare, high-quality primary and secondary schooling, if only by moving into expensive neighborhoods, and high-quality college training, all of which means that opportunity itself has been commodified. In other words, if you want people to be able to invest in their futures, they need an affordable option. So, in an attempt to present good opportunities to a poor community, the Chicago Housing Authority commissioned the construction of Cabrini-Green. Built on a former slum and housing 15,000 people at its peak, Cabrini-Green was constructed with progressive forethought. The sturdy cinder block housing units included separate kitchens and bathrooms, tenant-controlled heat, and fireproof building materials, with high-rises featuring elevators as well as open-air balconies, wide hallways, and green spaces to promote socialization between tenants. While these features might seem like obvious inclusions for housing today, they were unusual for low-income housing at the time. And it helped that Cabrini-Green was affordable, with tenants paying a fixed rent based on a percentage of their annual income. However, housing is only one piece of the pie. To prevent crime, you need good education and job opportunities in addition to affordable housing. But then came the neglect of the Cabrini-Green housing project. When elevators broke, they went unrepaired. Garbage chutes clogged up to the 15th floor. Pipes froze over in the winter, and electricity went out frequently. Graffiti remained plastered on walls, and green spaces were paved over with concrete to further cut down on maintenance costs. Apartments which caught fire were left boarded up instead of being repaired, and unoccupied units were left unlocked, a perfect space for drug dealers, gangs, and other vagrants to inhabit. When challenged, elected officials did little to help. As an example, then Mayor Jane Byrne moved into Cabrini-Green to showcase her commitment to fixing the issues within the housing project. She stayed for 3 weeks. Instead of fixing the glaring issues in the buildings, police increased patrols and began conducting highly publicized raids on suspected criminals. Tenants such as Marion Stamps organized protests to pressure the city of Chicago to invest in Cabrini-Green. Meanwhile, outsiders like Brother Bill would frequently visit the neighborhood in the name of stopping crime. Almost all efforts were met with grand media attention and minimal success. In the vacuum left behind by the lack of government care, gangs sprung up to take control of the neighborhood. The residents had little choice but to negotiate with gangs for protection from criminal activity in the area. You can even see this evidence in the original Candyman. Yeah, that's a real gang the cast and crew had to hire as bodyguards to film on location. And all of this is only scratching the surface of everything that went wrong with Cabrini-Green.
Let me put it to you this way. If you're poor, your family's poor, you went to underfunded schools, you can't afford a college education, the jobs in your area don't pay well, you're barely scraping by so you can't afford to accumulate savings, and on top of all of that, you're in a neighborhood that's heavily policed? What other choice do you have other than to join a gang for protection in your neighborhood, or to commit some burglaries to put bread on your table? Hunger makes a thief of any man. And who ends up getting the blame for this? Of course it's not the politicians who are constantly failing their constituents. No. That's ridiculous. We're gonna blame the victims of these situations. Yeah, let's blame the victims for doing everything they can to try to break out of these desperate situations when all other social systems have failed them. Great idea. I mean, heavens forbid we help the black citizens living in this building that started construction when, segregation was still legal. Cabrini-Green is a real-world encapsulation of how the government continues to fail black citizens. The Candyman reboot had this perfect opportunity to take those themes that were set up in the original film and expand on them by revisiting the recently gentrified Cabrini-Green area. The Candyman as a character is already so tightly knit into this idea of injustice, being the victim of racial violence, so he's the perfect character to explore these ideas with. After all, Candyman is the literal ghost of a victim of racial violence. I mean, it doesn't get more on the nose than that. Despite it being perfectly set up, this movie doesn't really explore the idea of the continual injustice of the Cabrini-Green area. Through flashbacks, we get some very brief glimpses of Cabrini-Green as this low-income housing project, and the characters just sort of tell us how crappy it was, but we don't spend time with Cabrini-Green. And that's partially because Cabrini-Green was torn down several years ago, but it's still not enough to solidify just how bad of a failure Cabrini-Green was.
I do like that this movie tries to make the Candyman a shadow of covered-up injustice by having him kill lots of snobby rich folks in the art scene. Those past injustices rear their ugly head because they can't be buried beneath the air of pricey sophistication, no matter how gentrified the area gets. And that's a thematically compelling idea. It's not that this film is incapable of exploring the heavy themes it's trying to tackle. In fact, it makes more of an effort than the original film did. Though it's undeniable that the original Candyman provided a nuanced look into the issues of Cabrini-Green, especially for the 90s, the socio-political themes are only touched on, with the themes exploring the power of urban legends and myth, while the story focuses on the haunting seduction of madness brought on by our titular phantom. So whenever the original film tells the audience about the political situation of its setting, whether it's pointing out racial prejudice, mentioning Cabrini-Green's proximity to Gold Coast, or outright telling us that gangs control the neighborhood, I'm willing to forgive the script since it's done out of necessity. The film's focus isn't on its political undertones, so the fact they're portraying this setting with any nuance at all is admirable, even if they could have done more. However, the same cannot be said for the 2021 reboot. The primary focus of this reboot is to bring those political undertones of the original film to the forefront and expand on them through a modern lens, to mixed results. Earlier I complained about how the reboot tends to explain political ideas to the viewer, but to the film's credit, with the amount of themes it's juggling, it at least tries to avoid going full TED Talk by employing lots of imagery and symbolism to great effect, which only makes the verbal explanations of the film's themes all the more obvious. As an example, we not only see gentrification through the laundromat being sandwiched between an axe-throwing joint and a Pilates studio, but also at the church, where a once beautiful mural has been literally whitewashed out of existence. These are great, subtle illustrations of the gentrification issue, which are unfortunately undercut by exchanges like,
"Who do you think makes the hood?" The city cuts off a community and waits for it to die. Then they invite developers in and say, "Hey, you artists, you young people, you white, preferably, or only, please come to the hood, it's cheap. And if you stick it out for a couple of years, we'll bring you a Whole Foods."
White people built the ghetto and then erased it when they realized they built the ghetto.
Similarly, when we see a flashback of Sherman Fields, the 7th Candyman, getting ganged up on by police, bees appear as a callback to the ants that swarmed the bee that stung Anthony. Here we see bees as a symbol, further tying systemic injustice to the hive of Candymen. And though characters telling us of the various other Candymen through history is appreciated to keep the story from getting bogged down by more flashbacks, we still get very on-the-nose lines like,
Candyman ain't a he. Candyman's the whole damn hive.
He's real.
Bell is real. Samuel, Sherman, Daniel Robitaille, they're all real. Candyman is how we deal with the fact that these things happen. That they're still happening.
These exchanges give me the impression that the writers don't trust the audience to figure out the message of the film by themselves. But while some themes get symbols and dialogue that's as subtle as a f***ing billboard, there's others like Anthony's hand injury, a wound that grows larger and more grotesque the more he learns of the continual injustice of Cabrini-Green, showing the scars of historic trauma physically manifested. But it also doubles as a symbol of Anthony's growing obsession with this legend, which also provides gross body horror and also kind of implies that Anthony might be becoming the Candyman either through his obsession or possibly by killing people in a state of psychosis? It's a lot.
All these ideas could mash up, they could be linked together, but there's some connective tissue that's missing. It felt like I got a bunch of sampler platters instead of a full meal, you know? Honestly, I can't see how they could have explored the themes in this movie to the depth that they deserve without either minimizing the slasher elements that are needed to keep the audience awake, or adding on to the runtime and giving more of that methodical deep dive experience that the original film had. And unfortunately, neither of those things are done with this movie.
But most annoyingly of all, the third act suffers from the exact same issue that Blumhouse's Halloween reboot had. And if you watched that video last year, you already know exactly where I'm going with this. Instead of writing their film backwards to get to the third act they wanted, the writers typed themselves into a corner. So clearly, the best way out of this dilemma is to make one of your characters suddenly crazy, with little to no foreshadowing or hints of their instability, so they can kidnap our main characters to the boss room for that epic showdown that the writers envisioned for their final act of this epic movie. Now, I've only seen this plot twist pop up in 2 major horror films in the last few years, but this writing element has quickly become my biggest pet peeve in modern horror. And I hope to God that it doesn't stick around, because I would hate to add Surprise Psycho to the list of overused cliches dumped into the formulaic horror movie generator.
Ultimately, the Candyman reboot is not a terrible film. It's really not. You can watch it and have a decent enough time. The issue I have is that it has so much unrealized potential that when I finished watching the movie, I felt disappointed. It's another sad case of too many cooks in the kitchen trying to make an extravagant meal out of a handful of ingredients and only having 90 minutes on the clock.
So what did you think of the Candyman reboot? Do you prefer it over the original? Let us know in the comment section down below. Don't forget to drop a like or dislike and subscribe for future videos. Our next video will be a huge project we've been working on off and on since last June, so be sure to follow us on social media and hit that bell to get notified of when that video drops. Plus we've got tons of other videos coming that you won't want to miss.
Okay, thanks, bye!